I think we should settle this before the wedding. The room went silent. The Christmas music playing softly in the background suddenly felt miles away. Even the crackling fireplace seemed to disappear as Ethan's father reached into the inside pocket of his navy blazer and slid a thick white envelope across the polished oak table. It stopped inches from my plate. No one said a word. My daughter Emily looked from the envelope to me, her smile fading. Ethan leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and wore the kind of confident grin that only comes from believing you've already won. Clear his throat. His mother lowered her wine glass and watched me with polite curiosity. I looked down at the envelope. My name wasn't written on it. Neither was Emily's. There was only one word printed neatly across the front: family. I slowly picked it up. The paper felt unusually heavy. "I think you'll understand why this is necessary," Ethan said, his voice calm, but carrying enough pride to fill the room. I didn't answer. Instead, I carefully opened the envelope while everyone watched. Inside was a stack of legal papers. Before I could read the first page, Ethan's father quietly added, "Please read everything." I nodded. I had spent 38 years in the United States Army. I'd opened mission briefings before dawn, letters informing families of unimaginable loss, promotion orders, retirement papers. Compared to those moments, opening an envelope at Christmas dinner should have been easy. Yet something about the expressions around that table told me this piece of paper would change several lives. I turned the first page, and for exactly 2 minutes, no one spoke. My name is Richard Walker. I'm 72 years old. Most people who meet me assume I'm just another retired old man trying to stretch Social Security until next month. I don't blame them. My pickup truck is 20 years old. My winter coat has a repaired sleeve. My boots have been resoled twice. I drink coffee at the same diner every Tuesday morning. I mow my own lawn. I never cared much about appearances. The funny thing is, none of those assumptions have ever bothered me, because none of them are true. What very few people know is that I retired from the United States Army as a 4-star general after nearly 4 decades of service. My military pension alone is a little over $28,000 a month. My home has been paid off for years. I have investments my late wife and I built carefully over decades. Financially, I've been comfortable for a long time, but comfort was never something I felt the need to advertise, especially after losing my wife, Margaret. She had a saying she repeated almost every Christmas. "Richard," she'd tell me while wrapping presents in our living room, "if you ever want to know someone's character, let them believe you have nothing." Back then, I thought she was simply being philosophical. Years later, I realized she was absolutely right. Emily had begged me to spend Christmas with Ethan's family. "Dad," she'd said over the phone a week earlier, "it'll mean a lot to him." I smiled. "I thought he usually spent Christmas skiing." "He changed his plans." "Why?" She hesitated. "He wants both families together before the wedding." That sounded reasonable enough. I accepted immediately. I didn't tell her I'd already noticed changes in Ethan over the past year. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make headlines, just little things. He'd started judging restaurants by valet parking. He complimented expensive watches more than kind people. He spoke differently to waiters than he did to business partners. Whenever he visited my house, he'd glance around the living room with polite disappointment, as though wondering why anyone would still own furniture older than their grandchildren. He was never openly cruel, just quietly dismissive, the kind of arrogance that often hides behind good manners. Emily either didn't notice or didn't want to. That Christmas afternoon, I deliberately wore my oldest brown coat. The zipper had been replaced years earlier. The elbows showed faint signs of wear. Margaret used to tease me that I'd probably be buried in it. I smiled at the memory before climbing into my old Ford pickup. The drive across Charlotte took about 35 minutes. Large brick homes replaced modest neighborhoods, perfectly trimmed hedges, luxury SUVs lined the streets. Every house looked like it belonged on a holiday postcard. Ethan's parents lived at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. Beautiful home, nothing excessive, just successful. Emily greeted me first. She hugged me tightly. "I'm so glad you came." "So am I." Ethan appeared moments later. "Merry Christmas, Richard." He always called me Richard. Never Dad, never Mr. Walker, just Richard. I never corrected him. He shook my hand. His eyes briefly drifted toward my coat. You know it's freezing outside. It is. You should let Emily buy you a decent winter coat. Emily immediately looked embarrassed. Dad likes that coat. Ethan laughed. Well, everyone deserves an upgrade eventually. I smiled. So I've heard. Inside the house smelled like cinnamon, roasted turkey, and fresh pine. Family photographs covered the walls. Everything looked warm, comfortable, normal. His mother welcomed me politely. His father gave me a firm handshake. Unlike Ethan, his eyes stayed on my face. Not my clothes, not my truck parked outside, just my face. That small detail stayed with me. Dinner began. Conversations flowed easily. Vacation homes, stock markets, luxury cruises, wine collections. I listened far more than I spoke. Eventually, Ethan laughed while telling a story about one of his coworkers. I told him, if you're still broke after 65, you probably made bad decisions your whole life. Several people chuckled. Someone nodded. Ethan glanced toward me. I mean, retirement should be comfortable if people plan ahead. I calmly sliced another piece of turkey. Planning matters, I said. It sure does. His mother smiled sympathetically. It must be difficult living on a fixed income these days. Emily shifted uncomfortably. Before I could answer, Ethan spoke for me. Richard manages. Manages. Interesting choice of word. I simply smiled, because I wasn't there to defend myself. I was there to observe. Margaret had been gone 6 years, but her lesson remained alive. Let people believe you have nothing. Eventually dessert arrived. Coffee followed. The conversation slowed. Then Ethan's father quietly stood, walked to the sideboard, retrieved a sealed envelope, and slid it across the table. I think we should settle this before the wedding. I opened it. The first page read, Premarital Property Agreement. No one moved. No one breathed. For the next 2 minutes, the only sound in the room was the turning of paper. I didn't sign. I didn't argue. I simply laid the papers back inside the envelope and folded my hands on the table. No one seemed to know what my silence meant. Ethan looked almost amused. I'm sure you understand, he said. It's standard these days. His mother nodded. We're only trying to protect family assets. I looked at her politely. I believe every family should protect what they've worked for. A look of relief crossed Ethan's face. He thought I agreed. His father, however, never relaxed. He kept studying me, as though he suspected there was something everyone else in the room had missed. Emily stared down at her coffee. I could almost hear her heart breaking. She hated conflict. She always had. Seeing her like that reminded me of another Christmas many years earlier, when she was only 8 years old. Back then, Margaret was still alive. Emily had wanted the newest bicycle in the neighborhood. Every one of her friends had shiny new bikes, with bright paint and fancy gears. Money wasn't the problem. Margaret and I could easily have bought one. Instead, Margaret found an older bicycle at a church charity sale. It had scratches on the frame. The basket was crooked. The paint had faded. Emily looked disappointed when she first saw it. Margaret simply smiled. Ride it for 1 week. Emily frowned. But everybody else has new ones. I know. Why can't I? Margaret knelt beside her. Because I want you to learn something before life teaches it the hard way. A week later, Emily came home smiling. My best friend didn't care what bike I rode. Margaret kissed her forehead. Exactly. Then she looked at me. People who care about appearances usually reveal themselves before you even ask. That lesson stayed with me far longer than Emily probably realized. It certainly stayed with me after Margaret passed away. She had been gone for 6 years now. Cancer doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care how many medals you've earned or how many soldiers you've led. It simply takes. The Army had prepared me for war. Nothing prepared me for walking into an empty house after 50 years of marriage. For months afterward, I found myself setting 2 coffee cups on the counter before realizing she wasn't there. I'd hear a joke on television and instinctively turn to tell her. Silence answered every time. Eventually, I stopped filling the empty side of the closet, stopped reaching across the bed, stopped expecting another voice in the kitchen. But I never stopped hearing Margaret's wisdom, especially when it came to people. She believed character was easiest to recognize when money disappeared from the conversation. After she died, I made a decision. I wouldn't change the way I lived, just because I could afford to. The old truck stayed. The old coat stayed. The same neighborhood stayed. Friends often asked why. My answer never changed. Because everything I own already works. Most laughed. Some didn't understand. I never felt the need to explain further. Military life had shaped me the same way. When I graduated from West Point, one of my instructors said something I've never forgotten. Rank is borrowed. At 22, I didn't fully understand. By 72, I understood perfectly. Every promotion, every salute, every office, every title eventually belongs to someone else. Only your character stays with you. That lesson kept my feet on the ground, even after I pinned on my 4-star. People often imagine generals living glamorous lives. Reality looks very different. Years away from family, birthdays missed, anniversaries celebrated through satellite phones, funerals attended, young soldiers buried, decisions that haunt you long after retirement. The stars on my shoulders never made me better than anyone else. They simply reminded me how much responsibility rested there. That's why I rarely mentioned my career after retiring. I didn't need strangers thanking me for my service every time I ordered breakfast. I preferred talking about fishing, weather, baseball, grandchildren. Life felt lighter that way. Emily met Ethan nearly 3 years after Margaret died. She called me one Saturday afternoon. "Dad." I immediately heard something different in her voice. "What is it?" "I met someone." I smiled. "Oh? I think you'll like him." Parents always hear that sentence with cautious optimism. A month later, she brought Ethan to my house. He arrived carrying homemade pecan pie. That impressed me. He shook my hand firmly, looked me in the eye, asked about my vegetable garden. For several months, I genuinely liked him. He worked hard, had built a successful commercial real estate business before turning 40. He treated Emily well. He laughed easily. Nothing seemed unusual. Then success began changing him. Not overnight, gradually, almost invisibly. The first sign came during dinner at a local steakhouse. An elderly waitress accidentally spilled water near our table. She apologized repeatedly. Before I could tell her it was fine, Ethan sighed loudly. "Can we get someone a little quicker?" She looked embarrassed. After she walked away, I quietly said she seemed overwhelmed. He shrugged. "If people can't keep up, they shouldn't do the job." Emily looked uncomfortable. I changed the subject. Months later, another moment came. We were driving through my neighborhood. Ethan glanced out the window. "You know, Emily." "What?" "Your dad should really sell this place." "Why?" "He could move somewhere nicer." "I like my house," I said. He laughed. "No offense, Richard, but this neighborhood peaked about 30 years ago." I smiled. So did I. He laughed harder, assuming I'd made a joke. I hadn't. The comments became more frequent. He admired expensive watches, judged people by the cars they drove, talked about wealth as though it measured discipline. Once, while standing in my garage, he noticed my old toolbox. He shook his head. "You could afford better equipment if you planned your finances." Emily immediately looked confused. "Dad's always been careful with money." Ethan smiled. "I know. I'm just saying retirement catches up with everyone eventually." I simply closed the toolbox. He had no idea the investment portfolio Margaret and I built decades earlier produced more income than I could comfortably spend. He assumed. I let him. Not because I enjoyed deceiving people, because assumptions often reveal more than questions ever do. 3 weeks before Christmas, Emily called again. "Ethan's parents want everyone together." "They seem nice." "They are." She hesitated. "I just want everything to go well." I heard the uncertainty in her voice. "Is something bothering you?" "No." It came too quickly. A father knows. There was something she wasn't saying. Still, I didn't push. Instead, after hanging up, I walked into my bedroom and opened Margaret's old cedar chest. Inside lay dozens of memories, letters, photographs, Christmas ornaments, and the old brown winter coat Margaret loved teasing me about. I lifted it carefully, smiled, then said aloud, even though no one was there, "Well, Maggie, I guess we're about to find out what kind of family our little girl is marrying into." On Christmas morning, I slipped that old coat over my shoulders, not because it was warm, not because I couldn't afford another, but because sometimes the simplest disguise tells you the most about the people sitting across the table. By the time dessert was served that evening, I realized Margaret had been right once again. The real test had never been about money. It had always been about respect, and the envelope waiting beside my coffee cup was only the beginning. I folded the prenuptial agreement neatly and slipped it back into the envelope. No one reached for dessert anymore. The pumpkin pie sat untouched. Steam still drifted from the coffee cups, but the warmth around the table had disappeared. Ethan finally broke the silence. "So, what do you think?" His tone was friendly enough, confident, almost rehearsed. I looked at him. "I think legal documents deserve careful reading." He smiled. "Exactly." His mother nodded approvingly. "We had an attorney prepare it." "I can see that. It protects everyone." "I believe it does." My calm answers seemed to reassure them. Emily looked relieved for the first time in several minutes. Only Ethan's father remained quiet. He hadn't touched his coffee. His eyes stayed on me, watching every expression, as though he expected something more. "I'll be honest," Ethan said. "I've seen too many marriages end badly." "So have I." "My parents worked their whole lives for what they have. They should protect it." "I knew you'd understand." He smiled again. I smiled back, because everything he said sounded reasonable on paper. The problem wasn't the document. The problem was the assumptions hiding underneath it. I continued reading. Most of the agreement dealt with Ethan's assets, his investment accounts, his business, his vacation condo in Myrtle Beach, his retirement funds. Then I reached another page. It described Emily's financial position: current assets, minimal; expected inheritance, unknown; future contribution, limited. I stopped reading for a moment, not because I felt offended, because I realized whoever prepared these papers believed my daughter entered the relationship with almost nothing. That assumption hadn't appeared out of nowhere. Someone had painted that picture. Emily quietly cleared her throat. "Ethan," he looked at her, "I thought we were signing this after Christmas." "We are." She glanced toward me. "I didn't know Dad would see it tonight." His mother answered before Ethan could. "We felt families shouldn't keep financial secrets." I nodded slowly. "That's a fair point." Emily looked at me apologetically. "I'm sorry. You have nothing to apologize for." She looked close to tears. I knew exactly what she feared. She thought I was embarrassed. She thought everyone in the room believed I couldn't provide for myself. The truth was, I hadn't felt embarrassed once all evening. Only curious. Conversation drifted into uncomfortable silence. Eventually, Ethan's mother tried changing the subject. "So, Richard." "Yes?" "Emily told us you're retired." "I am." "What did you do before retirement?" "I served in the Army." "Oh," she smiled politely. "My brother was in the National Guard." "That's honorable service." She nodded. "How long were you in?" 38 years. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's quite a career." "It was." "What rank did you retire with?" Before I could answer, Ethan interrupted. "Mom, military people never like talking about themselves." He laughed. "Richard's pretty humble." I simply smiled. He had unknowingly rescued me from answering. Across the table, Ethan's father noticed. I saw it in his eyes. He'd caught that interruption. Dinner resumed, at least on the surface. But small comments kept appearing, like tiny cracks spreading across glass. Ethan picked up my wrapped Christmas gift. "This one's from Richard." He shook it gently. "Feels light." "It is." Inside was a handmade wooden keepsake box. I'd spent nearly 3 weeks building it in my garage. Black walnut, hand-sanded, finished with natural oil. No factory could have made one exactly like it. Emily smiled immediately. "You made something." "I did." She opened it carefully. The room grew quiet again. The grain of the walnut shimmered beneath the Christmas lights. Inside the lid, I'd carved one sentence. Family isn't built by money, it's built by showing up. Emily covered her mouth. It's beautiful. She stood and hugged me. I love it. Ethan looked inside. It's nice. Nice. Just nice. His mother admired the craftsmanship. His father gently ran his fingers across the wood. You made this yourself? I enjoy woodworking. He turned the box over. No nails? No hidden joints? Yes. He smiled for the first time that evening. My grandfather used to build furniture exactly like this. For a brief moment, something genuine passed between us. Respect. Not because of rank, not because of money, simply because one craftsman recognized another. Later, Ethan opened his parents' gift, a designer watch worth several $1,000s. Everyone admired it. He held it toward me. Beautiful, isn't it? It certainly is. I've wanted one for years. I'm glad you got it. You don't wear watches. I lifted my left sleeve. The old military field watch Margaret had given me 25 years earlier rested on my wrist. Scratched crystal, faded numbers, still working perfectly. Ethan laughed softly. You should let Emily upgrade that too. I looked down at it. I don't think I could. Why not? It still reminds me of someone. He didn't understand. Emily did. She reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. No words were necessary. After dinner, we moved into the living room. A football game played quietly on television. The women carried dishes into the kitchen. Ethan poured himself another drink. So, Richard, yes, you've got to admit retirement can be stressful. It can. My financial advisor says most people underestimate how much they'll need. Sometimes they do. I've been trying to convince Emily that we should handle more of your expenses. Emily immediately looked uncomfortable. Ethan, what he doesn't need, I gently interrupted her. It's kind of you to think about me. He smiled. I just don't want you struggling. I thanked him. Because despite everything, I still believed his concern was real. Misguided, wrapped in pride, but real. The danger of arrogance is that people often mistake it for generosity. While everyone else talked, Ethan's father quietly walked onto the back porch. A few minutes later, I stepped outside myself. Cold December air greeted me. Christmas lights reflected across the yard. He stood looking into the darkness. Without turning around, he spoke. You were an officer, I smiled. I was. I can usually tell. What gives it away? The posture? I chuckled. I've tried losing that. It never leaves. He finally turned toward me. What rank? There it was. The question Ethan had accidentally prevented earlier. I considered answering. Instead, I retired satisfied. He nodded slowly. I understand. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. I don't think you've told my son everything. No. I don't think you've told Emily everything either. No. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets. Sometimes children only see what we let them see. They do. He looked back through the living room window. They're good kids. They are. But my son's gotten too impressed with success. I said nothing. I've noticed it. His voice carried genuine disappointment. I was hoping tonight I'd be wrong. There was sadness in his eyes, not anger. Sadness. The kind only a father recognizes. At that moment, I realized something important. I wasn't the only parent quietly evaluating the man sitting inside that house. His own father had been watching too, and judging by the look on his face, he didn't like what he had seen. Clear his throat. When we walked back inside, the envelope still rested on the coffee table, waiting. I had a feeling it wasn't finished telling its story. When we walked back into the living room, everyone had settled into uneasy silence. Emily sat on the edge of the sofa, twisting the engagement ring on her finger. Ethan stood beside the fireplace, trying to look relaxed, though I could tell he wasn't. His mother busied herself collecting empty coffee cups. Only his father remained seated, his eyes resting on the envelope. I picked it up once more. I finished reading it, I said calmly. Ethan smiled. So? It's professionally written. Clears throat. His attorney must have charged a small fortune. Every paragraph had been carefully crafted, every asset carefully listed, every contingency thoroughly considered. From a legal standpoint, I had no complaints. From a father's standpoint, I had several. I closed the folder. May I ask a question? Of course, Ethan replied. If Emily signs this tomorrow, what exactly will she be protecting? He looked surprised. My family's assets. I understand. My business. I understand. My investments. I understand. My retirement accounts. I understand. He smiled confidently. I've spent 15 years building everything I have. I respect that. So, what's the problem? I looked directly at him. The problem isn't what you're protecting. It's what you're assuming. The room became quiet again. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? I gently tapped the section listing Emily's financial position. This document says my daughter enters this marriage with very little. His attorney had estimated her net worth at less than $80,000. I almost smiled, not because it was funny, because it was astonishingly inaccurate. Ethan shrugged. That's basically true. Emily looked confused. Dad, I turned toward her. Sweetheart, have I ever discussed my estate with you? She blinked. No. Have I ever shown you my investment accounts? No. My trust documents? No. My retirement income? No. She looked embarrassed. I never asked. I know. I smiled warmly, and I appreciated that. Ethan crossed his arms. I'm not sure what any of this has to do with the agreement. It has everything to do with it. His mother spoke gently. We're simply trying to avoid future misunderstandings. I admire that. Then why are you objecting? I'm not. Everyone looked puzzled. I'm objecting to assumptions. I reached inside my coat, not for a wallet, not for a checkbook. Instead, I removed a thin leather folder that had traveled with me for years. I always carried it. Inside were emergency contacts, medical information, military identification, and several documents Margaret had insisted I keep close. I laid it beside the envelope. Emily looked at it curiously. I've never seen that. You've never needed to. I opened it slowly. The first thing I removed was a simple blue identification card, my retired military ID. I slid it across the coffee table. Ethan picked it up first. His expression didn't change immediately. Then, his eyes stopped moving. He read the line beneath my photograph again. His face slowly lost its color. He looked at me, looked back at the card, then read it one more time. Finally, he whispered, General? No one answered. His mother reached for the card. What is it? She adjusted her glasses. Then, she froze. Oh. Emily leaned closer. Her mouth fell open. Dad! She stared at me, as though she were seeing a stranger. She couldn't finish. Ethan kept shaking his head. No. I smiled gently. Yes. His father finally spoke. I thought so. Every eye turned toward him. You knew? He nodded slowly. Not exactly. He looked at me. But I suspected he wasn't telling us everything. Ethan stared at both of us. You mean, his father interrupted quietly, the way he carries himself. He looked toward me again. I asked what rank you retired with. You did. You never answered. I didn't, because you didn't need to. For several moments, no one spoke. Then Emily finally asked the question she'd apparently never imagined asking. Dad, what? You were a general? A 4-star general. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Why didn't you tell me? I smiled sadly. You never asked. I would have wanted to know. I wanted you to know me. She covered her mouth. Oh my God. I didn't want my rank sitting at the dinner table every time we shared a meal. She stood and hugged me. I had no idea. I know. I'm sorry. For what? I thought you thought I was simply an old man. She nodded through tears. I was. And that's exactly what I wanted. Ethan still hadn't spoken. He continued staring at the identification card. Finally, He managed, "Why would you hide something like that?" I looked at him calmly. "Why would I advertise it?" He opened his mouth and then closed it again. There was no answer. His mother finally asked, "So you've been receiving a military pension all these years?" "Yes." "How much?" I hesitated. His father answered for me. "It doesn't matter." I nodded. "You're right." But Ethan looked desperate now. "How much?" I met his eyes. "A little over $28,000 each month." Silence. Complete silence. His mother's coffee cup slipped slightly against the saucer. Emily simply stared. Ethan looked as though someone had removed the floor beneath him. His entire picture of me had collapsed in less than 30 seconds. But I wasn't finished. I reached back into the leather folder. "There are two more things you should probably see." I removed several folded documents. Trust summaries, nothing confidential. Just enough to explain. "I created these after Margaret passed away." Emily took them first. Her hands trembled as she read. "What?" She looked up. "Dad?" I nodded. "The house." She looked back down. "It's already in my name." "Yes." "Since when?" 3 years ago." Her eyes widened. "You never told me." "You didn't need to know then." Another page. "The lake cabin. Also yours." She gasped softly. "The investment accounts." "Those too." She looked completely overwhelmed. "But I wanted everything arranged long before I was gone." Ethan's breathing had become noticeably slower, as though he were trying to process numbers that no longer fit the story he'd been telling himself. I continued. "There are education trusts for every future grandchild." Emily burst into tears again. "Dad, there are charitable funds." Another page. "And enough investments that, if managed responsibly, you'll never have to worry about retirement." No one moved. The attorney's estimate that Emily owned almost nothing suddenly seemed absurd. She wasn't entering the marriage empty-handed. She was entering it financially stronger than anyone in that room had imagined. I looked toward Ethan. "I never intended to discuss any of this." He couldn't meet my eyes. "But once someone writes down assumptions about my daughter," I gently placed the prenuptial agreement on top of the trust documents. "I think the full picture deserves to be seen." For the first time all evening, Ethan's father smiled. Not because of the money, not because I had surprised everyone, but because the truth had finally entered the room. The envelope had done exactly what he hoped it would do. It had revealed far more than anyone expected. And judging by the look on Ethan's face, the hardest conversation of the night hadn't even begun. No one spoke for nearly a full minute. The trust documents remained spread across the coffee table, beside the prenuptial agreement. One stack represented assumptions, the other, reality. Eventually, Ethan cleared his throat. I didn't know. I know. You never told us." "No." His voice sounded smaller now. "I would have treated things differently." I looked at him quietly. "Would you?" He hesitated. "I think so." His father finally stood. "I don't." Everyone turned toward him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't raising his voice. If anything, he sounded disappointed. "Son," Ethan looked at him. "Ask yourself one question." "What?" "If Richard had remained exactly who you believed he was an hour ago," he pointed toward the envelope, "would you have changed a single sentence in that document?" Silence. Ethan lowered his eyes. His father continued. "That's your answer." No one challenged him, because no one could. He walked toward the fireplace, hands folded behind his back. "When you were 12, he said quietly, "your grandfather took you fishing." Ethan looked confused. "What does that have to do with this?" "You remember the old man who cleaned fish at the marina?" "I barely remember him." "I do." His father smiled faintly. "You thought he was just another retired fisherman." "I guess." "He owned half the marina." Ethan blinked. "I never knew that." "No." His father looked directly at him, because he never needed strangers to know. The room fell silent again. Then he turned toward me. "My father used to say something similar." I smiled. "So did my wife." He nodded slowly. I figured. For the first time that evening, it felt as though two old men were having one conversation, while everyone else quietly listened. Ethan finally spoke again. I'm sorry. I believed he meant it, but apologies spoken after discoveries often carry more confusion than understanding. I asked him one question. When did you decide I wasn't successful? He looked startled. I never. You did. No. The coat? He looked down. The truck? He stayed silent. The house? Still nothing. The pension? He closed his eyes briefly. I made assumptions. You did. I shouldn't have. No. He rubbed both hands together nervously. I know what you thought. He looked ashamed. I thought Emily might have to support you someday. Emily looked horrified. Ethan! He couldn't even look at her. I'm sorry. I nodded slowly. That concern wasn't the problem. He looked up. The problem was believing a person's value could be measured by what you saw. He whispered, You're right. His father spoke quietly. We raised you better than this. Those words hurt him more than anything I could have said, because they came from the one man whose opinion still mattered more than his own. His mother finally wiped away a tear. I think we all owe Richard an apology. I shook my head. No. She looked surprised. This evening wasn't a mistake. It wasn't? No. I looked around the room. It was an education. No one interrupted. Sometimes, I continued, truth arrives disguised as embarrassment. Ethan slowly nodded. I understand now. I wasn't sure he did. Understanding isn't measured by one conversation. It's measured by what happens afterward. His father walked over to the coffee table. Without asking permission, he picked up the prenuptial agreement. Then, to everyone's surprise, he closed it, folded it, and handed it back to Ethan. I think, he said quietly, your attorney needs to rewrite this. Ethan looked confused. What? Not because Richard has money. He looked directly into his son's eyes. But because your attitude changed the moment you learned he did. No one argued, because everyone had watched it happen, including Ethan himself. He slowly accepted the envelope. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely humbled. Outside, snow had begun falling, soft, quiet, almost unnoticed. The kind of snowfall Margaret used to love watching from our front porch. I found myself thinking about her again. If she'd been sitting beside me that night, she probably wouldn't have said, I told you so. She would have simply smiled, because she already knew. People always reveal themselves, eventually. Christmas ended quietly. No dramatic arguments, no slammed doors. No one stormed out. In many ways, that made the evening even more unforgettable. As I drove home through falling snow, Margaret's old coat still wrapped around my shoulders. I found myself smiling, not because I'd surprised anyone, because Margaret had been right. Again. People always tell you who they are. You simply have to give them enough time. 3 days later, my phone rang. Emily. Dad? Morning, sweetheart. Can I come over? Of course. She arrived alone. No makeup. Hair tied back. Carrying 2 paper cups of coffee, just like she used to years earlier. She sat at the kitchen table, without speaking for nearly a minute. Finally, I'm embarrassed. I poured more coffee. You shouldn't be. I should have stopped everything sooner. You didn't know. I should have. I shook my head. Love makes assumptions too. She smiled sadly. I guess it does. She looked around the kitchen. Nothing had changed. Same cabinets, same old clock, same photographs. Margaret still smiled from the picture beside the window. Emily noticed it. I miss Mom. So do I. She stared at the photograph. I kept thinking about that bicycle. I laughed softly. You remembered. I finally understand why she did it. I nodded. She wasn't testing whether your friends liked old bikes. No. She was teaching you how people see value. Emily looked down. I forgot. No, you simply hadn't needed the lesson again. She reached into her purse, then placed the prenuptial agreement on the table. I can't sign this. I looked at it quietly. Have you told Ethan? Not yet. What are you going to say? She took a deep breath. I'm going to ask him one question. I smiled. Only one? If your opinion of my father changed because you learned he had money? She swallowed. What happens when life takes that money away? I said nothing, because no father should answer that question for his daughter. She had to hear the answer herself. That afternoon, she met Ethan. I didn't attend. She later told me everything. At first, he apologized repeatedly. He admitted he had judged too quickly. He admitted he had been arrogant. He admitted he had made assumptions. Then Emily asked her question, exactly as she'd practiced. If Dad had still been living on only his pension, would you feel differently today? She said he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked away. That silence lasted only a few seconds, but it contained everything. Eventually, he whispered, I don't know. Honesty, painful, incomplete, but honest. Emily thanked him. Then she stood, removed the engagement ring, placed it gently on the table, and walked away. Not because he was a bad man, because he still had important lessons left to learn before becoming a husband. She cried for weeks. So did he. Sometimes, doing the right thing hurts everyone involved. 6 months passed. Spring arrived. Flowers returned. Life slowly settled. One Saturday morning, someone knocked on my front door. I opened it. Ethan stood there, alone. No expensive coat, no luxury car, just blue jeans, work boots, and an old pickup truck I'd never seen before. He looked different, not older, quieter. I was hoping we could talk. I invited him inside. He noticed the woodworking bench in the garage. You built another one? I nodded. He smiled. I was wondering. He hesitated. If you'd teach me. I looked at him carefully. Woodworking? Patience. That answer surprised me. For the next 3 months, every Saturday morning, he came over. We built shelves, birdhouses, small tables. Nothing valuable. Everything meaningful. He rarely spoke during the first few weeks. Eventually, he started asking questions. Not about investing, not about military life, about Margaret, about marriage, about leadership, about mistakes. One afternoon, while sanding a cedar box, he quietly admitted something. I've spent my whole life trying to look successful. I kept sanding. I know. I don't think I ever learned how to become successful. I finally looked at him. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. I know that now. The workshop remained quiet, only sandpaper moving across wood. Sometimes, the loudest lessons arrive without anyone raising their voice. There are 2 more things you should probably see. I removed several folded documents, trust summaries, nothing confidential, just enough to explain. I created these after Margaret passed away. Emily took them first. Her hands trembled as she read. What? She looked up. Dad? I nodded. The house. She looked back down. It's already in my name. Yes. Since when? 3 years ago. Her eyes widened. You never told me. You didn't need to know then. Another page. The lake cabin. Also yours. She gasped softly. The investment accounts. Those too. She looked completely overwhelmed. But I wanted everything arranged long before I was gone. Ethan's breathing had become noticeably slower, as though he were trying to process numbers that no longer fit the story he'd been telling himself. I continued. There are education trusts for every future grandchild. Emily burst into tears again. Dad, there are charitable funds. Another page. And enough investments that, if managed responsibly, you'll never have to worry about retirement. No one moved. The attorney's estimate that Emily owned almost nothing suddenly seemed absurd. She wasn't entering the marriage empty-handed. She was entering it financially stronger than anyone in that room had imagined. I looked toward Ethan. I never intended to discuss any of this. He couldn't meet my eyes. But once someone writes down assumptions about my daughter, I gently placed the prenuptial agreement on top of the trust documents. I think the full picture deserves to be seen. For the first time all evening, Ethan's father smiled. Not because of the money, not because I had surprised everyone, but because the truth had finally entered the room. The envelope had done exactly what he hoped it would do. It had revealed far more than anyone expected. And judging by the look on Ethan's face, the hardest conversation of the night hadn't even begun. No one spoke. Not because they didn't have anything to say, because every sentence that had seemed so certain only minutes earlier had suddenly become dangerous. The crackling fire was once again the loudest sound in the room. Ethan finally lowered himself onto the couch. He looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally. The confidence he'd carried all evening had disappeared. He rubbed both hands over his face before looking toward me. "I owe you an apology." His voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't answer immediately. Over 38 years in the Army, I'd learned something important. The first apology isn't always the honest one. Sometimes it's simply a reaction to embarrassment. I wanted to know which kind this would be. "What are you apologizing for?" I asked calmly. He blinked. "I judged you based on—" He glanced toward my old coat hanging by the front door. "The way you lived, in the truck, and the house." He swallowed. "I assumed if someone looked poor—" He couldn't finish. I gently completed the sentence for him. "Then they probably were." He slowly nodded. "Yes." I leaned back in my chair. "That's an honest answer." Emily quietly wiped tears from her cheeks. She looked at Ethan. "I've been trying to tell you that for months." He closed his eyes. "I know." "No." She shook her head. "You heard me." Her voice cracked. "You just never listened." His mother finally spoke. "Richard." I looked at her. "I owe you an apology as well." "You don't owe me anything." "I do." She looked ashamed. "I kept asking questions about your retirement because you assumed I needed help." She nodded. "I thought we were being kind. I believe you were trying to be, but it came across as pity." "It did." She lowered her eyes. "I never intended that." "I know." The truth was she hadn't been cruel. She'd simply accepted the story she'd been given. The person who truly needed to examine himself wasn't sitting across from me. He was sitting beside her. Then Ethan's father stood. He walked over to the Christmas tree and stared at the lights for a long moment before speaking. "I think it's time everyone understood something." His voice carried the same calm authority I'd heard on the back porch. "I asked our attorney to prepare that agreement." Ethan looked surprised. "I know." "No." His father turned around. "You don't." The room became still again. "I never prepared it because I thought Emily wanted your money." Everyone looked confused. "I prepared it because I wanted to find out whether my son had started believing money was the only thing worth protecting." Ethan stared at him. "Dad, I've watched you change over the last 3 years." His father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You stopped calling your grandmother because she moved into assisted living." Ethan looked away. "You complained about your cousin's wedding because it wasn't held at an expensive venue." Silence. "You laughed at your college roommate for driving an old truck." Another silence. "And tonight," he glanced toward my old coat, "you introduced a good man as though he were someone who needed saving." Ethan's shoulders slumped. "I didn't mean—" His father interrupted. "I know exactly what you meant." There was sadness in every word. "I know exactly what you meant." There was sadness in every word. "I just don't think you realize what it said about you." Emily quietly reached for my hand. "I've noticed it too." Ethan looked at her. "You never told me." "I did. When the waitress—" He frowned. "The waitress who spilled water," he remembered. "You apologized to me because dinner took longer." She shook her head. "You never apologized to her." He lowered his eyes. She continued. "And when Dad's truck broke down, I offered to buy him another." "No." Emily looked straight into his eyes. "You offered to pick one." "I wanted to help." "You wanted him driving something you wouldn't be embarrassed to park beside." No one disagreed because no one could. For nearly a minute, Ethan simply stared at the floor. Then he stood. Without saying a word, he walked to the front door. Everyone watched him. He picked up my old brown coat. Carefully, almost reverently, he carried it back into the living room. "I'm ashamed." His voice trembled. "I looked at this coat." He held it gently in both hands. "And I thought it told me who you were." He laughed bitterly. "It never crossed my mind that maybe—" He looked at me. "It was telling me who I was." No one moved. That sentence settled over the room like fresh snow. His father slowly nodded. "I've been waiting years to hear you say something like that." Ethan walked over and handed me the coat. "I'm sorry, Richard." I smiled faintly. "Try again." He looked confused. "What?" "You've been calling me Richard for almost 3 years." He hesitated. Then for the very first time, he said quietly, "I'm sorry, Dad." Emily immediately began crying again. Not dramatic tears, relieved tears, the kind that come after holding your breath for far too long. I stood and embraced him. He hugged me tightly. Not because I was a retired general, not because I had money, because for the first time I think he saw me as the father of the woman he loved. Nothing more, nothing less. When we finally sat back down, Ethan reached for the envelope. He opened it, removed the prenuptial agreement, then looked toward Emily. "I don't want you signing this tonight." His mother looked surprised, but he shook his head. "No." He looked at me. "I need to understand something first." "What?" "How do you spend nearly 40 years becoming one of the most respected officers in the Army?" He glanced at my old watch. "And then live like none of it mattered?" I smiled. "Because it didn't." He frowned. "I don't understand." "It mattered while I was serving." I paused. "But the day I retired," I looked around the room. "I wasn't a general anymore." I pointed toward the handmade walnut box sitting beneath the Christmas tree. "That's why I carved those words." He read them again. "Family isn't built by money. It's built by showing up." I continued quietly. "One day your business will belong to someone else." He nodded slowly. "One day my medals will belong to a museum." Silence. "One day every dollar any of us have will belong to somebody else." The room was perfectly still. "So what remains?" No one answered. I did. "The people who remember how we treated them." Ethan's father walked over and rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "I don't care whether you marry into wealth." He looked directly at Ethan. "I care whether you become the kind of man worthy of your wife." Ethan nodded, tears finally running down his face. "I've got a lot to fix." "You do," I said gently, "but recognizing it," I smiled. "What is where real leadership begins." For the first time that evening, Christmas no longer felt like a courtroom. It felt like a family learning to tell the truth. And sometimes that is the greatest gift waiting beneath any Christmas tree. Christmas dinner ended far differently than any of us had imagined. For the first time that evening, the tension had disappeared. The envelope still rested on the coffee table, but somehow it no longer felt like a weapon. It had become a lesson. Ethan slowly reached forward and picked it up. He looked down at the prenuptial agreement for several long seconds before opening it one last time. Then, without hesitation, he folded every page back together and slid it into the envelope. "I don't want Emily signing this tonight." His mother looked surprised. "But—" He gently shook his head. "No." Then he turned toward me. "I need to understand something first." I nodded. "What?" He glanced around the room before looking back at me. "How do you spend nearly 40 years becoming one of the most respected officers in the United States Army?" He paused. "And then choose to live like none of it ever happened?" I smiled. "Because it didn't." He frowned. "I don't understand." "It mattered while I was serving." I let the silence settle before continuing. "But the day I retired, I wasn't a general anymore." No one spoke. I was simply a husband. I smiled at the memory of Margaret. "Then I became a widower." Another pause. "And after that," I looked toward Emily. "And I was simply a father." The room remained perfectly still. I pointed toward the handmade walnut box resting beneath the Christmas tree. "That's why I carved those words." Everyone's eyes followed my hand. "Family isn't built by money, it's built by showing up." I continued quietly. One day your business will belong to someone else. Ethan lowered his eyes. One day my medals will belong to a museum. Silence. One day every dollar any of us have will belong to somebody else. The fire crackled softly behind us. So what remains? No one answered. I did. The people who remember how we treated them. Those words seemed to settle over the room more heavily than anything that had been said all evening. For the first time since dinner began, no one was thinking about wealth. No one was thinking about investments. No one was thinking about inheritance. They were thinking about character. Ethan stared at the wooden box for a very long time. Finally, he looked back at me. I think, his voice broke, I've spent years protecting the wrong things. I smiled gently. Most people don't realize that until it's too late. He slowly nodded. I'm glad I realized it tonight. 3 days after Christmas, Ethan called me. I almost let the phone ring out. Not because I was angry, because I wanted him to have enough time to think before we spoke again. When I answered, he stayed quiet for several seconds. Hi, Dad. For the first time, the word sounded natural. Not forced, not polite, just honest. Good morning, I replied. I hope I'm not bothering you. You aren't. I was wondering if I could stop by. Of course. I'd rather come alone. I understand. An hour later, his polished SUV pulled into my driveway beside my old pickup truck. He stepped out carrying breakfast and 2 cups of coffee from the little diner I visited every Tuesday. I figured you'd appreciate familiar food. I smiled. I do. We sat at my kitchen table for several minutes without touching breakfast. Finally, he spoke. I haven't slept much. I imagined you hadn't. I keep replaying Christmas. So do I. He slowly looked around my small kitchen. The old cabinets, the worn wooden table, Margaret's cookie jar that still sat on the counter, exactly where she'd left it years ago. I spent almost 3 years trying to understand why you lived like this. I waited. I thought it was because you didn't have another choice. He shook his head. But now, he looked around once more. I think you chose this life. I did. Why? I stood, walked into the hallway, and returned carrying an old photograph. Margaret and I were standing beside our very first house. The paint was fading. The porch leaned slightly. The yard was uneven. Yet neither of us had ever smiled wider. I handed him the picture. This house cost us everything we had. He studied it quietly. You both look happy. We were. What changed? We paid it off. He laughed softly. No, I mean after that. I smiled. We realized something. What? The happiest years of our marriage happened before we had very much. Silence settled between us. We spent decades earning more. I gently tapped the photograph, but we never became happier than we already were. He slowly nodded. So after retirement, you stopped chasing things. I started protecting peace. He stared into his coffee for a long time. I think I've spent years chasing the wrong finish line. I think, I answered quietly, you've been running someone else's race. Those words stayed with him. I could see it. After another long silence, he reached inside his jacket and pulled out another envelope. I couldn't help smiling. I'm starting to think envelopes follow you around. He laughed. I deserve that. Inside was the prenuptial agreement. Every page carried one large diagonal stamp. Void. I asked the attorney to destroy the original. You didn't have to. I know. I wanted to. He hesitated before continuing. Emily and I met with another attorney. Oh? We're writing new estate documents. I nodded. That sounds fair? They'll protect both of us equally. I smiled. They should. He looked at me again. We're also creating something else. What? A charitable foundation. I raised an eyebrow. For veterans. He nodded. And for military families living through long deployments. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Margaret would have loved that idea. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The wedding was postponed by 4 months, not because anyone demanded it, because Ethan asked for time. I want to earn this marriage, he told Emily. She agreed. During those months, I watched a different man slowly emerge. Not overnight. Real change never happens overnight. It happened in quiet decisions. He began visiting the VA hospital with me once every month. The first visit was awkward. Later, he admitted he hadn't known what to say. You don't have to say anything, I told him. Just listen. So he did. He listened to stories from veterans who had buried friends, military spouses who had spent birthdays alone, parents who had welcomed home sons, and daughters who were no longer the same people they had sent away. Driving home after one visit, he stared quietly through the windshield. Finally, he whispered, "I've spent years admiring people because they made money." He paused. "I think I should have spent more time admiring people who made sacrifices." I smiled. "It isn't too late," he nodded. "No, it isn't." When spring finally arrived, Emily and Ethan stood together beneath a small white chapel surrounded by blooming dogwood trees. The ceremony was simple. No extravagant decorations, no unnecessary display. Just family, just promises, just truth. When it was over, Ethan walked over and handed me something wrapped in brown paper. I opened it slowly. Inside was another handmade wooden keepsake box. Not nearly as perfect as mine. The corners weren't quite square. The finish wasn't smooth. I smiled anyway. Inside the lid, he had carved one familiar sentence. "Family isn't built by money. It's built by showing up." I looked at him. "You remembered." He smiled. I finally understood. As we stood there together, I realized something Margaret had known long before I ever did. Money can change a person's lifestyle. Success can change a person's reputation. But only humility has the power to change a person's heart. And sometimes, the greatest inheritance a father leaves behind isn't wealth. It's wisdom someone chooses to live by. The wedding took place on a quiet Saturday morning in late May. There were no television cameras, no luxury ballroom, no orchestra, no endless display of wealth meant to impress people who would forget it by the following week. Instead, there was a small white chapel surrounded by blooming dogwood trees. The guest list was short: family, a few close friends. Several veterans Ethan had met during those months of volunteering, a nurse from the VA hospital, two Gold Star families, and an elderly couple whose furnace Ethan had quietly paid to replace after hearing their story. Months earlier, none of those people would have imagined being invited. Neither would Ethan. I arrived early, as soldiers usually do. Old habits survive retirement. I wore a simple dark suit instead of my old dress uniform. Today wasn't about my service. It was about theirs. Emily found me standing outside beneath an oak tree. She slipped her arm through mine. "You look handsome, Dad." "So do you," she smiled. "I've never been less nervous." "I can tell." She took a slow breath. "I almost married the version of Ethan who needed to prove something. And today? Today I'm marrying the man who stopped trying." I nodded quietly. "Those are very different men." "They are." Inside the chapel, Ethan stood near the altar, greeting every guest personally, not because anyone told him to, because he wanted to. When he noticed the veterans arriving, he walked down the aisle to welcome each of them. Some moved slowly with canes. Others carried scars no one could see. He shook every hand with genuine respect. No photographs, no speeches, just gratitude. One elderly Marine stopped before taking his seat. He smiled at Ethan. "Thank you for listening," Ethan answered softly. "No, thank you for teaching me." The ceremony began a few minutes later. The minister spoke about commitment, about forgiveness, about choosing one another every single day. As Emily and Ethan stood facing each other, I realized neither of them looked perfect anymore. They looked honest. Somehow that was far more beautiful. When it came time to exchange vows, Emily spoke first. "I promise never to measure your worth by what you earn. I promise to remember who you are, even when life becomes difficult." Tears quietly filled Ethan's eyes. Then he began. "I spent too much of my life believing love needed to be protected by contracts." He paused. "I know now that trust isn't something you sign. It's something you practice." He looked directly at Emily. "I can't promise to be perfect, but I promise to keep showing up." Every person in the chapel understood exactly what those words meant. I felt my throat tighten, not because of the vows, because Margaret should have been sitting beside me. For just a moment, I imagined her hand resting gently over mine, the way it always had during weddings, graduations, and every ordinary moment we quietly treasured. I smiled anyway. She was there, just differently. After the ceremony, everyone gathered outside beneath the spring sunshine. Children laughed across the church lawn. Someone started playing old country music through a small speaker. Nobody seemed interested in leaving. Ethan eventually walked over carrying a neatly wrapped package. "I have one more gift." "For me?" He nodded. I unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a handmade wooden keepsake box. The joints weren't perfect. The finish still carried tiny sanding marks. It was obvious someone had learned by making mistakes. I loved it immediately. Inside the lid, one sentence had been carved by hand. "Family isn't built by money. It's built by showing up." I looked up. "You made this?" "I did. It took me 3 tries." I laughed. "The fourth one turned out pretty well." He smiled. "I had a good teacher." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he embraced me. Not the quick handshake hug men sometimes exchange out of obligation. A real embrace. The kind fathers remember long after the day itself is over. As the afternoon sun settled over the chapel, I looked around at the people sharing food, laughter, and stories. No one was talking about investments. No one cared about inheritance. No one mentioned the prenuptial agreement that had once threatened to divide this family. Those things had quietly disappeared. What remained was something far more valuable: respect, grace, and a family that had finally learned the difference between protecting wealth and protecting one another. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end, I hope you understand that this story was never really about a prenuptial agreement. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about military rank. And it certainly wasn't about proving who was right. It was about something much easier to lose: perspective. When we're young, we often believe success will protect the people we love. So we work harder. We earn more. We buy bigger houses, drive nicer cars, collect titles, collect achievements, collect everything except the one thing our families quietly need most: our presence. I spent 38 years in the Army. I learned how to lead soldiers, how to make impossible decisions, how to stay calm when everything around me was falling apart. But the greatest lesson of my life didn't come from a battlefield. It came from watching one young man discover that character is worth more than comfort, that humility is worth more than pride, and that respect cannot be demanded, only earned. As I've grown older, I've noticed something. The people who leave the deepest mark on our lives are rarely the richest. They're the ones who answered the phone, who showed up at the hospital, who sat beside us after the funeral when everyone else had already gone home, who remembered birthdays, who forgave mistakes, who stayed. One day every medal will gather dust. Every business will belong to someone else. Every bank account will carry another person's name. Every possession we spent years protecting will eventually become someone else's responsibility. But the way we loved people, the way we treated them, the kindness we offered when no one was watching, those things have a way of outliving us. That's the inheritance that truly matters. If you're a father, a mother, a husband, a wife, a son, or a daughter, don't wait for a crisis before telling someone they matter. Don't assume there will always be another Christmas, another birthday, another ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Life has a quiet way of reminding us that someday isn't written anywhere on the calendar. Show up while you still can. Listen while people are still willing to talk. Forgive while hearts are still able to heal. And never confuse providing for your family with being present for your family. Those are not the same thing. As for me, the handmade walnut box still sits on the shelf in my living room. The old military watch still keeps time. Margaret's photograph still rests beside the window, where the morning sunlight reaches it first. None of those things are valuable because of what they're worth. They're valuable because of what they remind me to become. So if this story leaves you with only one sentence, I hope it's the one carved into that little wooden box. The sentence that quietly changed an entire family. Family isn't built by money. It's built by showing up. Thank you for spending a little of your time with me today. Take care of the people you love, and whenever life gives you the choice between impressing someone or simply being there for them, choose to be there. You may never realize how much that moment is worth, until one day it becomes the memory someone else treasures for the rest of their life.